Good to see everyone. Thanks for dropping in. Good to be with you all. So I'm going to pray in just a second, and then I'm going to dive into a presentation on this topic, the Pastor Theologian, Resurrecting an Ancient Vision. That is actually the title of a book that I have stolen, but I've stolen it from really good friends who wrote the book, so it's okay. Actually, that's the name of a book that Gerald Eastand and Todd Wilson, who are the co-founders of the Center for Pastor Theologians, wrote about 10 years ago. So I've been working with them over these years. So I use that title for the presentation. And then we'll dive in. And I'd love this to be interactive, conversational, raise questions along the way. I'll pause along the way and kind of see how we're doing. My goal is not necessarily get through all the material that I want to get through. It's more to kind of see what this is sparking and have some conversation around this vocational calling of the pastor theologian. So let me go ahead and pray, and then I'll dive right in. Father God, we're grateful to you for the time that we have to be together. God, I pray that as we reflect on the calling of the pastor as pastor theologian, that you would encourage us, that you would give us vision for who you have called us to be as shepherds of your church. And I pray, God, that each one here, and wherever you have them, whatever role they're in, wherever they are in terms of encouragement or discouragement or opportunity or feeling around for open doors, God, I just pray that you would be with us here in this time, and that this would be a time that encourages each of us to be the shepherds of the church that you've called us to be. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So, the pastor theologian, resurrecting an ancient vision. I mentioned yesterday, for those of you who were there yesterday at the seminar that I did in the afternoon, I kind of gave a very short kind of overview of the pastor theologian vision at the beginning, kind of to position some things for what we were doing. So I want to go back now and recap some of those things and dig in a little bit more. And then I'm going to walk us through just some of the vision that we at the CPT have developed, and that's kind of driving our vision as an organization, our mission as an organization, and what we view as a critical reclamation project for pastors to reclaim our identity as theologians of the church and to really operate out of that identity. So these are two of the driving convictions that shape the ministry of the Center for Pastor Theologians. First is, pastors are the primary theologians of the church. I don't say pastors should be the primary theologians of the church, or pastors ought to be the primary theologians of the church. Pastors are the primary theologians of the church, whether we know it or not, and whether we're really inhabiting that vision of the pastorate or not. We are the primary theologians of the church. We are the people who shape the theological vision of our congregation, whether we know it or not, whether we attend to that or not, whether we give energy to thinking about what that means or not. Pastors are the primary theologians of the church. God established the office of pastor as a theological shepherding office to shape the vision of God's people, to shape what I talked about yesterday around theological imagination. God has called pastors to inhabit that role, to be shepherds of the church's theological imagination, to call the church and to equip the church to walk in light of who God is, and to walk by faith and not by sight. So pastors are the primary theologians of the church, which brings with it then a second conviction, which is that the church is the primary location of theology. The church is a theological community. The church is the place where theology takes place. What we do when we gather as the church is not we come together like any other community on the face of the earth. We don't come together out of a shared, similar affection for each other. We hope to have that, but that's not what calls us together. Right. We don't come together because we all like basketball. And so we come together to hang out around basketball. We don't come together because we have shared affinities. We come together because we are being drawn together by God, who's called us to be in a community with one another that he is the author of, not we ourselves. The church is what theologians have said over the centuries, a creature of the divine word. The church exists because God speaks the church into existence. The church doesn't exist because of our initiative. The church doesn't exist because of our programs. The church exists because God wills the church to exist in a way that no other community on the face of the earth exists in that same way. So the church is a theological reality, which means that the church is the location where theology is to take place. And for most of the history of the church, pastors were her primary theologians. Think about the great theologians of the church. I don't know who comes to your mind, just a few that come to my mind. Irenaeus, in the 2nd century, leading the church as a pastor of the church. Augustine, we were just talking about. There's this old line that says, anywhere you go in theology, Augustine's already been there. Augustine was a pastor. And Augustine's theological reflections are being driven by pastoral questions and theological questions about the church's mission in the world. Augustine was a pastor. Luther was a pastor. He was a monk first, and then he led the Reformation on accident. Not what he meant to do, that's what happened. And then he left there and he pastored a church in Wittenberg, and he taught in an ecclesial context in Wittenberg, and he led the Reformation as a pastor. Calvin was a pastor in Geneva. And he was shaping the pastors in Geneva. He was pouring into the pastors, but he was also pastoring a local congregation. When we think about the great theologians of the church, they were pastors. We're the outliers. In the last couple hundred years, when theology has been vacated from the church, and we'll talk about why that has happened in a few minutes, has been located elsewhere, and pastors have lost our identity as theologians. And that's what we need to reclaim. So in most of the history of the church, then, the church was the patron of theological learning. If you wanted to grow as a theologian, if you wanted to study theology, you would go to church institutions that trained people in theology so that they could be pastors. Very few were university professors. There were universities around. The university that I attended in the UK, the University of Cambridge, my college was called Jesus College in Cambridge, and Jesus College was founded in 1492, 4 years before Columbus, 1492. When the bishop came in, the nuns who had been there, it was a monastic community, the nuns who had been there, there weren't many of them left. The bishop came and he relocated the nuns somewhere else, and he brought in a university college of people who were learning to be trained to be pastors. That's what theological education was for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. It was church-based theological formation for the point of theological education and shaping people who would be pastors, priests in that context of the church. So if you were going to be a pastor, you studied in an ecclesial theological institution, an institution that was run by and rooted in the church for the sake of forming pastors as pastor theologians. Okay, so you lived out your pastoral calling as a pastor theologian. So that was the way that it was for 1,000 years. For 1,000 years. From about the time of Augustine to post-Reformation, when we turned to what is called the modern era. Right? And what happens in the modern era is that theology became outsourced to the academy. Different kinds of academic institutions arose in the early modern era. And there's a story to tell here. We don't have time, nor would I want to bore you with all the details of the shift from ecclesial theological institutions to academic theological institutions. It was around the time of the Enlightenment, the understanding of what knowledge is started to shift. Knowledge became more about the immanent than the transcendent. Knowledge became more about objective, rational concerns than concerns with mystery and the things of God. And that formed a different kind of academic institution. And theology then tried to find its place in the academy. And when theology tried to find its place in the academy, it changed. And theology, which had been ecclesially based, now became academically based. And you had a growth in academic theology. Then the academy starts to become the patron of theological education. And academic criteria came to dominate theology. And I'm going to say in a minute, I'm not against the academy. Okay? I'm not against the academy. I trained in the academy. I taught in the academy. I'm for the academy. But what I am concerned about is when the academy is the primary social location of theological education, we lose a lot in the church. And pastors lose identity when that happens. Pastors lose our theological identities. And again, as we'll talk about in a second, other identities then come in to the pastoral vocation. If we're not rooted in our theological vision, if we're not rooted in our theological identity, then in that vacuum, other identities are going to come in. And I think that's a tremendous problem with what has happened to the church in the 20th century and early 21st century. And we'll talk about that in a second. So social location matters. Social location matters. Theology in the academy serves a particular purpose, and we need that purpose. I am not against the academy. I think the academy can serve a particular purpose for a particular season, but it is not to be the primary social location of theology. The problem is we've made the academy the primary social location of theology. We then send people to the academy to be trained as pastors. And they go to the academy and they do academic theology, and then they graduate, and now your theological training is done. Do you want your doctor to have gone to med school? Yes. If you're going to a doctor who's 20 years out of med school, do you want your doctor to have been doing some kind of education from the time they graduated med school till now?
Yes.
Yes. We don't have that in the construction of the church in the late modern era in which we are living. We have to do it ourselves. We have to figure it out ourselves. We don't have the structures for continuing to form pastors in theology, and so we try to take all this theology in the seminary and kind of get it into people and think that we need to do in 3 years what's going to last them the rest of their life. It's impossible. It's not the way that this works. And so when we have located theology primarily in the academy, what we have done is we have hamstrung pastors. One, by equipping them to do theology in a very particular way, the academic theological way. And two, by saying we're going to download as much theology, as much learning as we can in your 2, 3, maybe 4 years. Maybe if you go on to get a DMin, maybe if you go on to get a PhD, you'll get more. But even then, that's limited. What we don't have is a vision for ongoing theological formation of pastors because we've located theology in the academy. So the problem that we have is that we have made academic theology to be the primary expression of theology, and it's not. And it can't be if the church is going to be healthy. It can't be if the church is going to be formed theologically. So social location matters. The social location of doing theology. Where we do theology matters. The social location determines what kind of theology we're doing. Theology in and for the church must be the primary theological expression of the work of theologians. Theology is ecclesially centered. It must be. The church is the proper habitat of doing theology. Theology, then, must be understood as that work which is done by the church, in the church, for the church, by pastors who are shepherds of that theological formation of the church. Pastors who are located in the social location of the local church are stewards of the church's theological reality. So the Center for Pastor Theologians was formed to reclaim the pastorate as the primary theological office of the church and to locate theology back in the life of the church. I want to pause here and talk a little bit about what you're hearing, what you're thinking, what questions are arising, what concerns, whatever you might want to talk about. How are we doing? What kind of things are you thinking about?
I got a question.
Yes.
I graduated seminary in 1993.
Okay.
So I've been out of seminary 31 years.
Yes.
I don't see any theological aspect taking place in the church. Where are we how did you begin this?
Within your church?
Yeah.
Well, so I'd say two things. One is what we're going to talk about is really pastors understanding our identity as theologians,
Okay.
right, and living into that, figuring out what that means. What does that look like? What does that change? And then two is we have to educate our church about who they are. We had a massive ecclesiology project to do as the church. Okay? So I think a huge part of this is, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, the goal of all of this is not the pastorate. The goal of all of this is the church. Right? This isn't about, hey, let's make sure pastors have enough time to read. Let's make sure that smart pastors can kind of create their schedule so that they can go in the study and shut the door and read and not be bothered. That's not what this is about. This is about the church. And I think, again, we could get there's a long conversation to be had here about evangelicalism and ecclesiology. Right? You guys know the Bebington Quadrilateral. Have you heard this? The kind of 4 marks of evangelicalism. You have cruciformity, right? We're cross-centered. You have bibliology, we're word-centered. You have mission, we're a people on mission. And then there's the 4th one, which just escaped my mind right now. It's like when I try to name all the 7 drawers, I never quite do it. But what's that?
You always miss sneezing.
Always miss sneezing. He's the one who always escapes us.
But
what's
what's
that?
Is it the one that says conversion? Or
Yeah, conversionism. That's it.
Yeah.
Conversionism. Yeah. So you have these 4 marks of evangelicalism.
Right.
What's missing in there is the church. The church isn't mentioned in these kind of marks of evangelicalism because evangelicalism has always been a movement that has kind of captured lots of different kinds of churches, but never really had an ecclesiology to it, like a driving ecclesiology that roots us in what we mean by the church. And I think what we have to do in our time, one of the very pressing concerns that we have is to build an evangelical ecclesiology that then makes sense of the church being a theological entity and makes sense of pastors being theologians.
Okay.
Right now our churches aren't shaped in such a way, our ecclesiology doesn't demand that the church understand itself and its identity theologically, nor does it understand then why we need pastors who are theologians.
Okay.
So that's the first thing I'd say. That I think some of those themes will come up as we go through. But in the 8 years that I was a senior pastor of a church, basically my mission was ecclesiology, was to train my church to understand what it means to be the church. And to do that in ways that remove a lot of the criteria of church, or decenter a lot of the criteria of church success that we as pastors and the people in our church are looking at as the criteria of church success, and bring in different visions about what it means to be the church. So I think it's a generational project that we're talking about here. And I think, we've got a mix of folks here. We got some younger folks. We got some more seasoned folks in the room. I think we're in a place in evangelicalism particularly, but the American church more broadly, where we have very little deep understanding that's rooted in our churches about what it means to be the church. And so again, all kinds of other criteria have come in about what success means for the church, that I think a lot of the visions of success that we have are actually taking us away from what it means to be the church.
Last night, during the tribute for the Youngs, one of the gentlemen mentioned that he still remembers walking through with Dick Young, knowing God and basic Christianity, and I was thinking one thing to simply say, like, what are the best, most readable theological books of the last century can be at least one starting point, because reading Knowing God will be transformative for almost anybody. So that was my first thought, was like, you don't, like you mentioned Irenaeus, you don't grab Irenaeus and hand it to your people and say, here, read this. And they
It's probably not going to be the best tack, I would agree.
But maybe that's a starting point to grab something that's truly beautifully and readably written. I don't know.
And I would say one of the other things I think is really important is if you're a pastor, how are you training your board, like the leadership team of your church? How are you training them theologically? So when I was a senior pastor, we had monthly board meetings, and once a quarter, the board meeting was I taught theology. I walked them through the stuff I was teaching my students in the seminary. We just worked through theology and talked about, why does this matter, and how should this impact the way we think about our budget? How should this think about the way we think about the programs of the church? How do we put our church in a theological context that we're not operating with as a shared understanding of what it means to be the church? So I think one of the key first steps is for pastors to really commit to training the people around us theologically. And I think the board is a critical part of that process. Other thoughts, other questions, comments, things you're doing as you think about what it means to be a pastor theologian?
Yeah, I've been doing in a small group format, about 15 people, just going through, I call it like Bible college light, so it's Old Testament, New Testament survey, systematic theology. We're doing that this semester. Just really introducing concepts and terms, and they've never heard of it. Never heard the term bibliology. So just and again, just trying to lay that basic foundation so we can read more and understand what they're reading.
And that takes intentionality. It takes finding the right people and gathering the right people. It takes our energy to do that, because I don't know when you're doing that is it a morning thing that you're doing?
It's an evening,
like an evening thing. That's an evening
Yeah.
in the week, right?
Every week?
Every week,
So I think that what are those kinds of things in your own context of how you can start this process of engaging people. Now again, we're going to talk about what we mean by theology in this context, because it's not only reading. That's important, but that's not all that it is. We'll get to that here in just a few minutes. All right, I'm going to move forward. Did you have? I saw.
Wait.
You sure?
Promise.
Okay. Very good. All right. I just want to do kind of let you know some of the mission, vision, values of the CPT. And this isn't intended to be just a CPT commercial here, but I think this captures the heart behind our vision of the pastor theologian in ways that I hope will be helpful. So the mission of the CPT, this is actually a new mission statement that we're just adopting: forming pastor theologians to shepherd the church in our complex world. So that's our mission. We want to form pastor theologians. We want to take people who are pastors or who are students headed towards the pastorate, and we want to form them in this particular vocational identity of pastor theologian. And our primary strategy for doing that is pastoral fellowships. So I talk a lot about, with the CPT, as I lead the organization, that we value inefficiency. Because what would be really efficient for us is record a whole bunch of lectures and put them online, and then have pastors download online lectures. That's not formative. That may be educational, but that's not formative. Being a pastor theologian isn't about being the most educated pastor. It's about being formed theologically. And those are different things. Those are different things. Which is one of the main reasons I have such concern for so much of what's going on in seminaries. And I serve on a board at Bethel, I serve in a seminary. But the pressures to be online and do everything online are so vast. Online education doesn't form us as pastors. It educates us, but it doesn't form us. So we want to form pastor theologians to shepherd the church. We use that word very intentionally, to shepherd the church. That was Jesus' metaphor for pastors. We think that's probably pretty good. And shepherding opens up some different aspects of leadership than just leadership does. So we want pastor theologians to shepherd the church in our complex world. Is it a complex world? Is it complex to be a pastor? We have to be deeply reflective people if we're going to shepherd our churches through the complexities of this world. We have to give our all in our understanding if we are going to be able to shepherd people through the challenges that are before us. And I hate to break it to you, but I don't think it's going to get any less complex anytime soon. Maybe you see signs of hope. If you do, I'd love to hear them. So I don't see that the world is going to get less complex. The stuff that's coming down the pipe for us, like we've been dealing with what do you do with cell phones and apps with kids, and how do you shepherd people through that? And when AI comes online in the way that it's about to come online, and the questions of what does it mean to be human start to press in on us in new ways, if pastors can't engage those conversations in deeply thoughtful ways, how are we going to shepherd our churches towards faithfulness in the complexities of the world? So we want to form pastor theologians to shepherd the church in our complex world. Our vision is building a movement of pastor theologians for the renewal of the church. And that's the goal here. The goal is the church. We're driven by 3 values, at the center of which is the pastor theologian. Okay, our first value is we are theological. I hope that's obvious by now. Right? Theological identity of the pastor, pastors who are formed theologically. But we're relational. We think that the relational context of pastors and fellowship with each other is the proper context for doing theology. Theology isn't just about reading a book and getting information. Theology isn't just about downloading a lecture and getting information. Theology is about the work of God in a community. And if pastors aren't in a community in which that kind of theological formation is happening, in relationship, deep relationship with other pastors, then we're not being formed theologically. So we talk about pastors being in non-competitive relationships. Maybe that doesn't land with any of you. Non-competitive relationships with other pastors in which the relational context creates the place where theology can form us. Luther didn't lead the Reformation by himself. Luther wasn't in Wittenberg doing the Reformation, writing these books and just kind of sending them out. There was a community of people around Luther. Every Reformation movement of the church has been led by communities of theologians. We need communities of theologians, pastor theologians, who are in deep formative relationships with each other. So this past Monday through Wednesday, I was in Oak Park, Illinois, where we're headquartered. We have a group that came in, about 15 pastor theologians that came from Monday to Wednesday, We do these fellowship symposia with pastor theologians. And this group has been meeting. This is our 6th time meeting with them. And on Monday night, we go to a house, someone's house in the church that hosts us. And we have Chicago deep dish pizza. And we hang out together. And then we get in a circle. And we go through what we call the rose and the thorn. Your last year, what's the high and what's the low? And in that community, as we went around, we had a pastor who 3 years ago planted a church, and then his wife left him in tragic circumstances with 5 children. And now 3 years later, he's on the other side of that, has recently gotten engaged, and is now replanting another church. That's the context for theology, is that relationship that we can celebrate with Nathan over time. I've heard horror stories in those contexts about what's going on and the challenges that pastors. We had a guy, he's in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He had a group in his church that wanted to oust him, and they printed stationery with their name of their group to get the pastor out. Right? I mean, they printed stationery. They were serious. One Sunday morning, they went through the parking lot and put a flyer with the stationery about getting the pastor out while he was inside preaching. And they went out and put this on the cars and the windshields of the people who were there at the church. Hearing those stories and being with him as he walked through that, that's the context of being a pastor theologian. Relationships matter. And then we're also ecumenical. If that word freaks you out, we could say interdenominational. We're evangelical. We're within the evangelical community. But we have pastors from all over the evangelical community. And we think that really matters. Because these kinds of things, these are good gatherings. These are important gatherings, denominational gatherings. But there are certain conversations that take place at denominational gatherings that are denominationally centered conversations. And those are important conversations, but there needs to be a place too where we're gathering with people from outside of our denominational context, outside of our geographical context, in order to have different kinds of conversations. So we are theological, we're relational, we're ecumenical. Now each one of these values is pressing against a counter value or counter misvalue that is forming the American evangelical pastorate. Okay? So theological means we're pushing against the pragmatism that is so easy to fall into in pastoring. What works? Right? What works? And if your driving question is what works, it's not very long before theology is out the window. And all kinds of other leadership theories come in. And we replace theological reflection with different kinds of leadership theories to try to make sure that the thing's going to work. And you may have a church that's working, but if it's not being formed theologically, it doesn't matter that it's working. So we are pressing against the pragmatism that has taken over the church. Relational, we're pressing against the individualism that's taken over the church. Churches are very individualistic. Pastoring can be very individualistic. We want to press against that by getting pastors into these deep relationships. And then the ecumenicals, we're pushing against the tribalism that is taken over the church. We're drawing closer and closer and closer, smaller and smaller and smaller boxes within which I will talk to people. And I won't talk to you if you don't fit within this box. And pretty soon, we're the only one left in the box. We want to push against that tribalism. We want to talk with lots of different kinds of people. Does that mean we believe everything that other people say? No. Does that mean I don't have convictions theologically? No. But there's something that happens in an ecumenical conversation that takes place where I can be challenged and I can have my own thinking stress test, and I need that if I'm going to shepherd the church. We need that together. So we're theological, we're relational, and we're ecumenical. Ultimately, yes?
I had a thought that each one of the things in parentheses are coping mechanisms or protectionistic.
Yes.
So the reason we fall into pragmatism is because we're afraid that God's way won't work. Individualism, we fall into fear that people will hurt me. and then
And they do.
tribalism, and they do.
And they
yeah.
do.
And the reality is God's way may not work
Yep.
for the goal that we have.
Yep.
And then tribalism too, it's the fear, or maybe another way to say that with that one is, I'm trying to protect against other voices that I may not agree with or things. So it occurs to me that this is a way also to say, we're going to push back against a protectionistic approach to the ministry.
Yeah. An anxiety-filled pastorate.
And also it works with the East of Eden micro kingdoms that you showed up yesterday, that model.
Yeah.
It's all over this. So.
It all works. It all works. Yes.
So just an observation,
Yeah.
every major shift in media, like the printing press,
Yeah.
the World Wide Web, and now AI,
Yeah.
has affected, every one of these categories.
Yeah.
And so if we're not prepared to just respond
Yeah.
in a way that we need to, then I just see the church gravitating further and further away from its center.
I agree. Yeah. Other thoughts? How does this strike you? Kind of resonate with things you think would be helpful for the pastorate?
Yes.
I hope so. Okay. So you were talking about just then, about if we're not centered, right, if we're not rooted, that is where I want to turn next to the identity of the pastor theologian. And I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I want to dig into this. Ultimately, this is an identity project. It's a pastor identity project, and it's a church identity project. I think one of the reasons we're so challenged in the church today is because pastors don't know who we are, and the church doesn't know who it is. And when you don't know who you are and the church doesn't know who it is, then again, all these other cross pressures are going to come in and they're going to drive us particular ways. And we're just going to try to be managing the way that the church is being driven rather than shepherding the church in her mission. I think we're in a pastoral identity crisis. Not to say every pastor is, but on the whole, as I look out at the pastorate, as I travel around, as I talk to pastors, it's very evident to me that there is a pastoral identity crisis. These pastors today are cross-pressured with all kinds of identities. Who are we? Who are we? What are the options? Are we CEOs? There's a lot of books out there that'll tell you that that's what you are as a pastor. Are we activists? There's a lot of people out there that'll tell you that that's the job. It's be an activist. Are we entertainers? A lot of resources out there to help you be more entertaining. Are we podcast hosts? I am, so that kind of Are we cruise ship directors? Making sure everyone's having a good time and they know where the next thing is? Who are we? What is pastoral success? That's really what this question is. Who are we is then a question about pastoral success. If we think that we're CEOs, then success is a well-managed institution. Should churches be well-managed institutions? Sure. Should that be the identity of the pastor? I don't think so. For activists, then success is social change. For entertainers, then success is a big church. Lots of people want to flock to hear me speaketh forth. For podcast hosts, it's a large platform. For cruise ship directors, again, it's people having a good time. And are they happy with me? Are they happy with me? And all of this has made the pastorate into what Stanley Hauerwas, who's a theologian out of Duke University, and talking about the pastoral identity, he says pastors today are a quivering mass of availability. A quivering mass of availability. Availability. What do you need me to be? What do you think I should be? And as you know, every single person in your church has a vision of what you ought to be. And they're not all the same. And so if you're trying to be what everyone in your church thinks you ought to be, how's that going to go? You're going to burn out. You're going to get crushed by that. The expectations and living up to those expectations of what people want us to be, it's impossible. And so we become a quivering mass. Right? No center, no steel, no core understanding of why I'm here, even if the folks around me don't want me to be that. But God has called me to this vocation. He has called me to do what He has called me to do. And that might disappoint people in my congregation. And they might leave. Or they might fire me. Those are tough pressures. Those are tough pressures. But what's our identity? What we want to do is encourage pastors, equip pastors, form pastors, call pastors to minister from this identity of pastor theologian. I want to be clear about a couple of things. When we say pastor theologian, we are not talking about people who got PhDs and can't get academic jobs and so have to be pastors. It's not what we're talking about here. We are talking about pastors who embrace the mission of theologian for the church. Theological shepherds of the church. And this is a high calling. It is a high calling, and this is a challenging calling. I think we need the best minds who have been trained well to be pastors. We don't need the best minds to go to the academy. We need good minds in the academy, and maybe some, because I know some academics who wouldn't want to be pastors. Maybe some of the best minds there. But this isn't the B team. This isn't the B team. We need the best minds in the pastorate. One of the ways that we talk about this is to say that pastor theologians are generalists. Pastor theologians are generalists. If you've been in the academy, or if you've been trained or do some teaching in the academy, what is rewarded in the academy is being a specialist, right? The universities, the modern universities, are built around specialists. Very narrow specializations that form university faculties. And so if you're going to get a job as an academic, if you're going to get a job as an academic theologian, you have to be a specialist. So I went and I spent 4 years of my life studying a particular aspect of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theology. I loved it. I had a great time. But when I came out of there, I knew a lot about one aspect of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theology that got me an academic job. But I wasn't trained to be a pastor by that. Because if you're going to be a pastor, you have to be able to move between Old Testament, New Testament, systematic theology, studying the culture around us, visitation, hospitality, conflict resolution, people, ideas. That's hard. It is way easier to be an academic theologian than it is to be a pastor. Way easier. Because you just do your thing and you know your thing, and that's your thing, and you get rewarded for it. I've been amazed at how little most academic theologians know about anything else other than the thing that they know. That's not who we need leading the churches. We need pastor theologians who can do this incredibly challenging but high calling of being a generalist for the church. And that generalist is not about thinness, because We need to deepen our understanding of these various things, but it takes a particular kind of formation to be able to do this and pull all this together. And I love the seminary, and I'm all for the seminary, but it can't do this. It doesn't do this. It's not supposed to do this. The problem is we try to create seminaries that do this, but it just doesn't work. Because you can't put this stuff in a syllabus, a lot of this stuff. Can you put systematic theology in a syllabus? Sure, I have syllabi. I give them out to my students. Can you put the New Testament in a syllabus? Sure. But once we're done, we know all this stuff. What happens to us when we leave seminary is, what on earth do I do with all of it? Because I haven't been formed, because seminaries can't do that. They try, so you try to do spiritual formation in a curriculum. That's just weird. You try to put spiritual formation in a curriculum. You give someone a syllabus for how to be formed spiritually. Here's the books that you read, and here's the conversations that you're supposed to have. And you get there, and hey, if you get an A, formed spiritually, I guess. Right? Congratulations. See, seminaries aren't equipped to do this, and they're not supposed to do this. But the problem is we don't have a structure for doing this. So what we're doing at the Center for Pastor Theologians, God willing, over the next season of our life as an organization, is we're trying to build that structure where you can go to seminary and get what seminary can do, and then come out and join a Center for Pastor Theologians fellowship community, and we will walk with you in your formation process as a pastor theologian in the context of relationships with other pastor theologians. See, we got too much pressure on the seminary to try to do it all because we don't have the church doing this work. If we can link these two together, now we're talking. But we're missing the huge critical component of this formative process, which is not the educational process, as important as that is. It's the real formation and the identity of the pastor theologian. So we are, as pastors, we are theological shepherds of the church. That's our identity. That's your core identity as a pastor. Theological shepherd of the church. And I hope what's come across by this, what I mean by this is not you're the smartest pastor in the room, you're the most well-read pastor. Should you read theology? Yes. I think reading is a critical component of pastoring, but it's not it. There's so much else that goes into it. So this means that we need to be shepherds who are formed in deep reflection in the presence of God, that we are in the presence of God. We are with others in the presence of God, and we're being formed in that presence. As I said earlier, pastor theologian is not about being a smart pastor, it's about being a formed pastor. It's about being formed theologically in the presence of God. The church is desperate for thoughtful leaders who can skillfully navigate the challenges of our complex age. We need this. Another way that I put this, and this would have come across, I hope, a little bit yesterday in what I was doing there, is pastors are theological narrators of reality. We are theological narrators of reality. There's a guy in my church that I pastored named Clarence Bass. Some of you might know Clarence. You guys knew Clarence. Clarence taught at Bethel Seminary for 35 years. He had studied under Emil Brunner in Switzerland and attended some of Karl Barth's lectures in Basel. And he came and he was a professor at Bethel Seminary, and then he was a guy in my church who I was preaching to week by week. He was a lovely gentleman. We would go out to lunch from time to time, and Clarence always wanted to go to the Byerly's Cafe on Snelling Avenue, so we would go to Byerly's and get the salad bar, and we would hang out together. And he would tell me stories. Tell me stories about theology. He would tell me stories about his career. But one of the stories that he told me that had nothing to do with Barth or Brunner or any of these people was when he was 12 years old. He was living in North Carolina, that's where he grew up, and he had a grandfather who was blind. And the grandfather lived with his family. And every day, Clarence would come home from school, and he would take his grandfather on a walk. And as he walked with his grandfather, and he guided his grandfather, he would describe the world to his grandfather. He would describe the color of the trees, the clouds, the sky, the flowers. He would describe the world. And that image has become for me a primary image of the pastor theologian. That what we do is we take our congregations for walks. And through the Word of God, we describe the world as it really is. The world that is not seen, but that we can see because by God's grace He has revealed to us the reality of who He is and how our world is. And our people that we're shepherding are so locked into the scene. And we ourselves can get so locked into the scene. But as pastors, what we need to do is we need to narrate reality theologically. Here's who God is. Here is how the world is. And here's why it makes a difference to you as a plumber, or as a teacher, or as a stay-at-home parent. Not keeping it up in the clouds where here's what Aquinas said in the 4th sentence of whichever book you might be expositing on Aquinas. Read Aquinas, but what difference does that make for plumbers? That's a theological task. And a hard one, but the right one, as we narrate reality for the people in our congregations. This isn't preaching Luther and Calvin at people. Maybe you're reading Luther and Calvin and that's helping you be a better theological narrator, but it's calling people into the work of God. Okay, so we talked about the identity of the pastor theologian. Now I want to finish up here in the next few minutes with the task of the pastor theologian. So what do pastor theologians do? Theologically, what do we do? Okay, so here's a way to think about it. There are two primary forms of theology in the American landscape. There's academic theology, which is theology that's done in academic institutions by academic theologians for other academic theologians, according to the criteria of academic theology, and according to the methods of academic theology. Then there's popular theology. And I would say this is kind of the devotional theology that we can get. Maybe we could call this Christian bookstore theology, some of which is good, fine, but maybe not the kind of meat that we really need in the world today. So you have academic theology, and you have popular theology. There's something missing. The thing that's missing in the middle is what we call ecclesial theology. Ecclesial theology is what's missing. Ecclesial theology has been the dominant form of theology for most of the church's history. And then when theology shifted into the academy, and ecclesial theology went away, academic theology came to dominate, and then what came in was popular theology. But what we're missing is ecclesial theology. So what is ecclesial theology? Ecclesial theology is theology that is from the church. It's rooted in the social location of the church. It fronts ecclesial questions. It doesn't front academic theological questions. Theological questions that academic theologians are asking, again, important questions, but they're probably not the questions that the plumber in the church is asking. Ecclesial theology asks, what are the questions that we are asking as a congregation? What are the driving questions that we need to be asking? And by this I don't mean felt need questions. I mean, what are the real theological questions that are at the heart of what it means for us to be the church? And what are we doing to address those questions? So it's theology from the church, it's theology for the church. Social location shapes theological form. As a pastor theologian, it may be that you don't need to write an academic article that footnotes every possible thing that you need to footnote. Because that's how the game is played in the academy. I got to footnote everything because I want to show all my peers that I've done all my research. Hope I'm making a good argument too. But that is probably not the form that theology in the church, that ecclesial theology takes. This centers theology in the life of the church. It's forming our communities as theological communities. And another way to put this is pastor theologians are not brokers of academic theology. By which I mean, this isn't just about reading the academic theologians and then translating that into the church. I read academic theologians. I want to be attentive to what's going on there. But I'm not a translator of academic theology into the church. I'm an ecclesial theologian. So it's not about being the smart pastor that can read the heavy stuff and then bring it into the church. Sometimes we might do that if it's helpful, but this is a different discipline that we're talking about. And it's a discipline that's been lost in the church and that we desperately need. So theology, local theology, theology for the church. Two quotes that I think summarize well what ecclesial theology is about. First is by William Ames, who was a British theologian a few hundred years ago. Theology is the knowledge of how to live in the presence of God. Theology is the knowledge of how to live in the presence of God. That's ecclesial theology. That's us in our congregations learning how to live in the presence of God. That's a deeply theological task. And then the second is Eugene Peterson. The pastor's responsibility is to keep the community attentive to God. To keep the community attentive to God. So what forms does ecclesial theology take? It can be books. And we have within our network, we have pastor theologians who are writing books. One of the work that we do as an organization is we have relationships with publishers, and we try to get some of our pastors who are in our network to connect to publishers who will be producing ecclesial theology books. We also have a journal in which we have our pastors writing articles that are ecclesial theology articles. So it can be books, it can be writing, but they're different. It's a different genre, it's a different form than academic theology. Sermons are ecclesial theology. In fact, I would say sermons are the primary expression of ecclesial theology. Sermons that are theological narrations of reality. That our preaching is narrating reality to people and it's shaping them to live in the presence of God. And to give their lives over more and more to Him. Children's curricula that shape children in theological imagination. Shape children's theological imagination. They are ripe for it. And that's more than telling Bible stories. And that's more than watching VeggieTales. Is VeggieTales a thing anymore? There's probably something else. We need to do theology with children.
Amen.
We need to do it appropriately, but we need to do theology with children. They should be being introduced to the doctrine of the Trinity, and Christology, and pneumatology, and what it means to be a human created in the image of God, forming their theological imagination. That's pastor theologian work. Youth ministry Bible studies that call students to deep theological reflection. Students need theology. They need to be grounded in a theological vision. Small group curricula that call congregants to deep theological reflection. Church newsletters, or whatever form that takes in your context. Are you shepherding theologically through what you're sending out to your congregation? Are you forming theological imagination through that? And I'll close with this and we'll have a few minutes to chat. The goal of the work of the pastor theologian, as I have said, is not the pastor theologian. For us, the pastor theologian vision is the means to the end. The goal is the renewal of the church. Our ultimate aim is a mature, healthy, vibrant church. what we believe as an organization, is that forming pastor theologians is essential to that work. If the church is going to be healthy, if the church is going to be the community that God has called us to be, and we are a theological reality at base. We're not a social club. We're not a country club. We're a community that exists because we are a creature of the Word of God that calls us into existence. If that's the case, then if we're going to be a mature church, we have to be being formed theologically. I think so much of what we see these days that's tearing the church apart is because we're not theologically formed. And so all kinds of winds of waves and doctrine on the left and on the right are coming in, and they're engulfing the church. I think we have a high calling as pastor theologians in this generation to do the hard work, the challenging work, to engage the church and call the church to be this theological community. All right, I'll stop there. We've got a few minutes. Would love to interact. Questions, comments, thoughts? Yeah.
Could you go back to your vision statement?
I can. Yep.
The
That one?
yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I love this idea. I guess I'd love, maybe if you could sketch real quick, maybe like what would it look like? I mean, because I don't think, what you're saying is not the goal is just that all of our churches know systematic theology
Right.
better. We're not just trying to take the academia
Right.
and just plop that into
Yep.
each church, right? So what happens, so let's say we have great pastor theologians and we're doing the work and the church is renewed. What does that look like, I guess? Like, what does it look like for a church, or larger the church? What would it look like if the church bought in and they were renewed theologically? Like, what's, when I think of vision, think of like, what does that look like? What's the win on the other side of that? I mean, renewal just for renewal's sake.
Yeah.
What is it that you hope that you see happening because this takes root?
Yeah, so I keep it pretty simple. I read Paul's letters and think, what is the church that he thinks is possible in the power of the Holy Spirit? And the church that he thinks is possible in the power of the Holy Spirit is a church in Ephesians 4 that he's describing as a mature church that's growing up into the character of Christ. And ultimately, that's what this is about. This is about the church looking like Christ, being inhabited by the character of Christ, by the power of the Holy Spirit. Okay? So I think we need to dig into the biblical vision of the church with faith that can be. Paul seemed to believe that the churches could look like the things that he was laying out and calling them to be by the power of the Holy Spirit. So I think, again, it's that ecclesiology question. What are we called to be as the church? And how can we take Paul seriously, take this vision seriously, and really allow that to start to form how we think about the programs of the church, how we think about the structures of the church, how we think about the finances of the church. How does this vision, how does what Paul is writing to the Philippians change the budget of my church? What would that do if we were going to be that community by God's grace? Does that help at all a little?
So you had said earlier, we need the best minds in the pastorate. So if I know that that's not me, but I'm taking a generational vision of this, like you said before, how do I participate in taking us to that desired future?
Well, so I guess I would say the first thing I would say is by best minds, I don't necessarily mean best performers in academic theology.
Sure.
We can kind of get that vision, but that's what like, how do we define best minds? I guess would be a question. And I would want to broaden it out from like smartest. And I don't know if that's what you're doing,
Well,
but just
I guess I'm just asking, what do I do then? if I agree with you,
Yeah, yeah.
how do I, what are the things that I will do to help further that generational vision?
Yeah. So, I think a number of things. One is you find other pastors who have a similar vision, and you start meeting together regularly to pray. To pray that God would be doing a work in you and in the church. You maybe form a community in which there's reading that you're doing that is reflecting on the church. As a CPT, we're building out over the next few years a broader network of pastor theologian fellowships. We would love to pull people into those fellowships where there can be time of fellowship and community and also reading together. Again, I think this is going to happen through local communities of pastors doing this work together. So I think you find other pastors with a similar vision and you start getting together and praying. The other thing is you have younger people, younger pastors in your influence, you mentor them in what this looks like. Because that's going to be the next generation, is what shepherds for the church are we going to be sending out in the next generation. So those are just a couple things that jump to mind. I think build into your schedule whatever you can to continue your work in your own theological reading. That's a huge part of this, is creating structures of our own lives where we have disciplines to continue our own reading, to continue our own deepening in our theological vision. So yeah, is that?
Yeah, that's great. I'm wondering some of the things that you had put up there before, and I'm specifically thinking about youth ministry and children's ministries.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's any more to that statement. I'm thinking about that now, like,
Well, yeah.
in this light.
I think it's fair to say that we have a lot of work to do at a lot of levels. But youth ministry and children's ministry is probably one of the key levels where we need to do some of this work. And I've got there's a guy in our fellowship, he's out in Washington, he's a children's pastor, and he's writing children's curriculum around theology that is age appropriate, but is doing that kind of work of thinking through theological imagination in children. And how do you do that? I think attending to some of these kind of things is really important for us. Yeah.
I think you kind of started to walk on to, my next question is, what maybe your vision is for people as pastors, like, this is a calling, and so if you to explain to them that being a theologian is part of your calling, okay, great, give me that. But then handing that down to that next level, which is my understanding of the big vision, which is the doctor not only continues to learn out of medical school, but then tries to get his patients to learn more about their bodies and stuff like that, so they can, to have our congregational theologians in a kind of, I want to push a button and I want you to just hand me a thing, kind of culture.
Yeah.
What do you see or what other thoughts have you had? And like I said, it sounds like teaching kids, skip that generation and grab the kids. But in that current place to kind of do that, have you guys had thoughts or strategies at changing the mindset of people to know you need to take this on yourself? As Luther said, you are responsible for your relationship with God.
So we're leaning into that. We got a grant that will come online this summer from the Lilly Endowment to do one of the programs in it is called an ecclesial identity process. And the idea there is it'll be a 2-year process for a local church. And the first year, the pastor and some of the board and some of the key lay leaders will form a leadership team. And we'll work with them through a mentor to do a 1-year ecclesiology project. What does it mean to be the church? Right, so the pastor is leading that, but taking the board and taking key lay leaders through that process for a year. And then they will develop themselves a 2nd-year program to take the whole church through. And that can look different ways depending on the context. That can be a series of gatherings. That can be a couple of retreats. And we have some funds through the endowment that we'll be able to offset costs for churches to do that. So we're leaning into what does that really look like to get to the culture of churches with this kind of a vision. Because for the first 15 years, we've really focused on pastors, and that's good and that's right, but we realize we're only going to go so far by doing that. This is an ecclesiology project. And so that's what we're moving into. So I don't know yet, because we're just kind of, this is what these next few years are going to be, is experimenting. But that's a big part of where we're going, is trying to get the idea of you're a theologian to everyone in the church. The pastor theologians. There's a new book that just came out, J.T. English and Jen Wilkin. Do you guys know this book? It's called You Are a Theologian.
Oh, yeah.
And JT's a pastor in Denver, at Storyline in Denver. He's one of our fellows. And he and Jen Wilkin wrote this book, You Are a Theologian. It's kind of describing what it means for everyone in the church to understand themselves as a theologian. And ultimately, I think that's a great vision. But if pastors aren't inhabiting that identity, then certainly the people in the church aren't going to be inhabiting that identity. All right, we're going to go. We got 2 more hands, and then I think we're running out of time.
To kind of bounce off that question, the indication that different generations and younger generations being born in the information age seem to be leaning more towards the academic, leaning more towards abstract concepts, and wanting to dig deeper on that. Are you seeing a shift in ecclesial theology with those younger generations, some of whom have left and are coming back to church, or who are coming up?
So I think what I see that's encouraging to me about the younger generation that I see coming up is they're serious about like these questions. You know, the deconstruction thing is that's working through the people who are saying, I'm not interested in deconstructing, but I do know there's a lot of challenges and questions. They're really wanting to dig into this stuff. They're wanting to dig into theology in new ways and in different ways. And they're finding a lot of the resources that have been out there wanting for them. So I think let's listen to them. Let's engage with them. Let's help them think, help us think. Let's think together with them. So I'm encouraged at that. Now there's also a lot of discouraging in that generation as well, clearly. But I think the other thing that so many of them are saying to us, and we see it, is they want relationships. They want communities. They know that just being on Instagram all day long is not good for them, and it doesn't form them well. And so they're looking for solid things, which is why I think the rush in so many in the church to go digital, and let's get digital because that's the way that we're going to meet people. I think we have to really think that through carefully. And the reason I think we often rush to digital is because we think that's when we're going to have the greatest impact. And we have to reassess what we mean by impact. I think these inefficient communities are actually going to be the way that carries this into the future. One more, and then we'll call it.
So, to go back to your misvalues that you talked about, especially individualism and tribalism, because those are such prevalent parts of our culture today, and have become increasingly prevalent within the evangelical movement to the point of aggressive individualism and almost militant tribalism. It seems like in addition to building an ecclesiology within congregations, there's also a deprogramming that has to happen where culture has so influenced the way that we think. What are your thoughts on how to do that so we can get to a place where we can be ecumenical and we can be relational?
So I have an optimistic thought and a pessimistic thought. Well, I'll start with my pessimistic thought. My pessimistic thought is, Jesus at times told us to shake the dust off our feet. And I think there are places and there are mindsets that trying to kind of break through some of the formation that has taken place may not be worth the energy to do that. That's my pessimistic thought. My optimistic thought is we've been formed that way for particular reasons. There have been problems lurking in the church that have formed people in particular ways. we can really get our arms around that, we may not be able to catch everybody, but if we don't do some serious assessment about what has happened to bring us to this place, that isn't a blaming of them or a blaming of whatever news channel on whichever side we don't like, or a blaming of whatever, but really is a hard interior look at why haven't we been forming people? What have been the processes that have brought us to this place? What have been the theological commitments, even though they may be negative theological commitments? What have been the things that have been embedded in our ecclesial culture that we need to address, and then have the courage to really start addressing those? I wish I had the silver bullet answer for you. I think it's going to be a long, hard, patient endurance for pastors to shepherd churches into a new season, but it's not going to be easy.
With DNA change.
It's DNA change.
That is not an easy button to fix.
We need a nice CRISPR technology to
Resurrection.
that works too.
Stop the DNA.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and call it. Thanks for your time. Thanks for your attention. Fun to be with you.